As we go through the third chapter, we are flip-flopping, we are zigzagging between practical questions about what we do if the messenger who brings the get gets sick. What do we do if a messenger gets ill? Can a messenger replace a messenger, for example? We're zigzagging between these practical questions of what happens if someone gets sick to like theoretical questions about, well, is it possible to assume that someone is alive if they're in some distant city and we can't see them? So there are both theoretical and practical questions addressed, and the Mishnah goes backwards and forwards. So at the close of the chapter, which we'll cover in the next session, it goes back to questions of uncertainty. But today, in the two Mishnayot, two very short Mishnayot, which we're going to cover now, it returns to practical questions of get. So if you like, we're zigging left and zigging right. And so with the zig left, the Mishnah begins, Hamevi get be'eretz Yisrael v'chala. Someone who brings a get in the land of Israel and gets sick. Now, remember, we've already learned that the action of bringing a get in the land of Israel is purely physical. All this messenger has to do is deliver the get. He doesn't have to give evidence that the get has been properly written and signed. He just has to deliver the get because the signatories are assumed to be available to validate it if required. So the Mishnah just rules in a way that doesn't surprise us at all. He just sends it with another. So the agent who becomes sick can appoint another agent. And in general, unless there's an objection, unless we think, for example, that the original husband would have an objection, in general, an agent has the capacity to appoint another agent because an agent is considered to be like a principal once he's been appointed, but not quite like a principal. The Mishnah is going to draw a little distinction. Hareze, if he said, Im Amarlo, if his principal said to him, Tolli mimena chafetz ploni, if he said to him, take for me from her such and such an object. So this agent is not only sent to deliver the get, but he's sent to take something back. And I do wonder, by the way, I mean, there are scandals today about men who demand money in order to give a get, and the wife in question is clearly sending something back valuable to the husband as part of the get transaction. So I do wonder whether something like that was not going on already in the time of the Mishnah. But anyway, the Mishnah says, Ima Marlo, if the principal said to the agent, not just deliver the get, but take back such and such an object. Lo yishalchenu biyad acher. He may not send it with another. In other words, even if he gets sick, he can't appoint another agent. Because the original principal might not want his deposit, might not want his object being guarded by somebody else. If you've borrowed, let's say, a lawnmower, you can't lend the lawnmower to somebody else. The action of taking a deposit is not necessarily replicable. We can't take a deposit and hand it on. Although in this case, if he did deliver the get is if he did appoint another agent, the get is still valid. What about if the get comes from abroad? This is much more complicated because in this case, we've learned that the bringer of the get has to give evidence, impersonal evidence, that the document was properly written and signed in front of him. And if he gets sick, he can't do that. Hamevi get mi medinat hayam, someone who brings a get from across the sea, vechala, and he gets sick. So what's he going to do? He can't just appoint another agent. So there's a puzzling expression in the Mishnah. Oseh bet din u'mushalcho. He arranges a bet din and sends him. We don't quite know who is doing the sending here. It's a very puzzling phrase. Oseh bet din u'mushalcho. He arranges a bet din and sends him. Very, very odd. Almost untranslatable. Ve'omer lifnehem b'fanai nichtav u'b'fanai nitchatam. And he declares before them, in my presence it was written, and in my presence it was signed. So he's going to make the declaration before the bet din, rather than making the declaration when he gets to the wife. He's ill. He may never get to the wife. He's going to call a bet din and make this declaration. And somehow another agent is being appointed, although the language of the Mishnah is not at all clear. But the Mishnah conveys the sense of this in its closing words. Ein hashaliach ha'acharon sarich sheyomar b'fanai nichtav u'fanai nitchatam. The last agent, that's the new agent to be appointed. And maybe maybe there's a chain here, right? Maybe the second agent got sick and appointed a third. The last agent is not required to testify. In my presence it was written, and in my presence it was signed. Because, well, he cannot, because it wasn't in his presence. He's an agent of the bet din, and that's essentially how the Mishnah closes. Eila Omer, Shaluach Beit Din Ani. I am the messenger of the court. In other words, the bet din has heard the testimony, and the bet din then appoints a messenger. This is, of course, now inside the land, probably inside the land of Israel, to send the get to the wife. And interestingly, even though the version of the Mishnah that we've looked at just now appears not only in Kaufman, but in all the printed manuscripts that I've had all the manuscripts I've had a quick look at while preparing this morning, and also in the Jerusalem Talmud. So I haven't found any variations on this Mishnah. There is a variation in the Babylonian Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud is a little bit easier to understand. And I've just brought the text here on the source sheet. Someone who brings a get from across the sea and becomes sick. Well, that's fine so far. Now, our Mishnah said, Oseh Beit Din. But in the Bavli, in the Babylonian Talmud, rather than saying Oseh Beit Din, it says Oseh Shaliach B'Veit Din. He arranges, rather than saying he arranges a bet din, it says he arranges an agent in a bet din. And then he sends him. He goes to the bet din and says, look, I'm appointing an agent to replace me. And I'm asking you essentially to make this person an agent of the bet din. And then, of course, we can understand the whole Mishnah. He declares before the bet din, in my presence it was written, in my presence it was signed. And then the last agent then, of course, becomes the agent of the bet din. So the bet din enable this get to be delivered to the woman who requires it. And in general, as we learned, maybe not today, but certainly in the time of the Mishnah, the bet din was always anxious to ensure that a get could be written, could be transmitted, could be delivered. So in this case, we can see that the bet din is essentially exerting its power to make sure that the get arrives in its proper fashion, in its proper form, with its full legal force at the right time.